Good afternoon and welcome. Thank you for being here today, and thank you for indulging me as I get to talk about things that I am very passionate about, and I hope that you are too, although I have come to find over time that not everybody is, and I still like to talk about it. Saginaw Choral Society is actually preparing for the final concert of our season, and this concert in particular, I'm going to drop my scores off, this concert in particular is thrilling for me because, as we've titled it, Titans of Music, it is two of the biggest composers in the musical repertoire. Not only classical, but these two composers informed so much music that even goes on today. When you tune into pop music today, you still hear samplings of Beethoven and Mozart. It's just inherent in what we do. And so, for me to have the opportunity to program Beethoven and Mozart in one concert is thrilling for me. It's, for many people, it's a great opportunity to be able to hear two composers who, quite honestly, were very fond of one another, but also had very sordid and tragic lives. And so, when I think about doing lectures like this, I often find that I make my notes, I get lost in the weeds when it comes to the music of things, and to be honest, you're probably less interested in the music and more interested in the gossip. And so we're going to start there. We'll actually start in the order of the concert. So we're opening with Beethoven's Choral Fantasy. And the Choral Fantasy was a great work that Beethoven wrote for piano and orchestra and chorus. It's a bit misleading because the chorus really only sings for about 6 minutes out of 20. The rest is piano and orchestra. And what Beethoven actually needed was, he had this very big performance planned where he was going to premiere his 5th Symphony, his 6th Symphony, parts of the Mass in C, and he needed something else that was going to be thrilling and just kind of led into that. It was a 4-hour program that he planned, and it was freezing cold in a concert hall. And Beethoven thought, gee, how can I make this more entertaining for people? Oh, I know, I'll add a piano piece. Yeah, not necessarily great and thrilling, but to him it was. And so he decided to come up with this, but the idea was so rushed that he himself improvised the entire opening of the piano. He sat at the piano and played the piano solo and improvised it. Now, the Choral Fantasy is a fantasia with a finale. So a fantasia, for those of you who do not know, is very free form. It's supposed to sound improvised. It's usually written out, but should sound like it's being made up on the spot. For much of it, Beethoven did make it up on the spot. Yeah. He had actually reached out to a poet that he knew for a text and said, I need something, compose it quickly so that I can write music to it. And he was not thrilled with the text. In fact, he wrote to the publisher afterwards and said, we might want to consider a different text for this piece. I think it was just too rushed, much like the composition of the music. So he was never fully settled on it anyway. But, again, it's a 4-hour concert, and he was prolific. He just kept writing things. Now, this happened in 1808. Beethoven at this point was 38 years old. So by the time he's 38, he's premiering 2 major symphonies, which we know and love, the most famous of them being the 5th Symphony. This choral piece that's 20 minutes long or so, parts of the Mass in C, which is a grand, grand work. And to him, it was just what he did. You know, it's come and fair. And so we'll find that a lot with these composers. Now, for those of you who plan on being at the concert, all of you, when you hear this, you will think to yourself, how did a man who is 38 years old write this? You know, I am currently 39 years old, and I think to myself, good Lord, there isn't anything that I have accomplished that is quite as grandiose as that. And he was never happy with it. He just wasn't. The work itself opens with this beautiful piano part. And you'll actually hear Catherine McMichael is the pianist. It is exemplary. And it opens with these big flourishes and runs, and she plays for probably about 7, 8 minutes before the orchestra even comes in. And in that time, he wrote out 2 distinct, beautiful themes that are very legato. They're very connected. It's a very tuneful work in general. You can hum these themes. So he opens with that, and then the orchestra comes in. Now, in the first performance, the orchestra came in wrong. And in fact, the clarinets played something completely out of context. They didn't come in at the right time, and Beethoven yelled, "Stop," right in the middle. And he yelled at the clarinets in front of an entire audience, reprimanded the clarinets for what happened, looked at the entire orchestra and said, "We do it again to the beginning." And he started the piano part over again. Yeah. When you look at photos of Beethoven, actually, he's often portrayed scowling. Beethoven was not like that. Beethoven himself was fond of jokes, and he loved pranks. He was a fan of hiding behind doors and jumping out at people to scare them. Yes. He was a hopeless romantic. I say hopeless because he fell in love with many women. And however, one in particular, we do not know. If ever you want to dive into some interesting writings, Beethoven has published letters that he wrote to the immortal beloved. We have no idea who the immortal beloved is. He never named her. They are extremely romantic in nature and very, I would say, very flattering overall. Scholars have tried for a very long time to identify who this immortal beloved is. Nobody really knows. We would like to, specifically because of that. But I'll give you a glimpse of Mozart here. In the first letter he penned, now this is in 1812, so this is 4 years after the composition of the choral fantasy. He writes, "My angel, my very self, why this profound sorrow when necessity speaks? Can our love endure without sacrifices, without our demanding everything from one another? Can you alter the fact that you are not wholly mine, but I am not wholly yours? Dear God, look at nature in all her beauty and set your heart at rest about what must be. Love demands all, and rightly so. No doubt we shall meet soon. And today also time fails me to tell you of the thoughts which during these last few days I have been resolving about my life." At this point, Beethoven is pretty much completely deaf. So Beethoven in his 20s starts to go deaf. He recognizes it and starts writing about the challenges right around 1801. So by the time we get to 1808, we're very steeped into he will no longer have hearing shortly. 4 years later, he's writing these letters. The interesting thing about them is there's controversial ideas about whether the immortal beloved is actually a person, or is it a muse, a non-tangible muse? Is it music in general? And so scholars continue to write and write and write. Musicologists have delved into this for a very, very long time, because that's what musicologists do. And nobody has any answers. But honestly, if you ever want to know what Beethoven was really like, read the letters. The letters to the immortal beloved. They are wonderful. We get glimpses of that in this work. By the time the orchestra comes in, after this long piano introduction, we get a whole new theme, and it becomes re-energized. What you will find listening to the Beethoven choral fantasy is, in 20 minutes, there are so many changes that happen throughout. It's entertaining. You find that you've lost track that 20 minutes have actually gone by. Now, in classical music terms, and this is somebody who has multiple degrees in classical music, if you can get lost in the fact that 20 minutes have passed by and not get bored, good for you. That's a good composer. That's a good piece. I myself, even, 20 minutes, I start going to other tracks or finding other things. My mind wanders in a concert hall. It is acceptable for your mind to wander in a concert hall. It's hard to do in this piece. which is one of the reasons that I find it thrilling, one of the reasons that I wanted to program it, other than I also wanted to show off Catherine McMichael's skill as our pianist, and she deserves that. Beethoven and Mozart, in general, were fond of each other. They met one time. Mozart had lived a very short life. Mozart was 35 when he died. He died of illness. We're not exactly sure what it was. Could have been rheumatic fever. Could have been a strep virus. But he died at 35. He met Beethoven when Beethoven was 16. Beethoven traveled to Vienna, specifically to meet Mozart, and we assume, based on the time that he was there, that they did have some lessons together. Of Beethoven, Mozart said, "This is a man who is going to do great things," which from Mozart at the time is one of the highest compliments you can get. Mozart was the child prodigy. He was the one. And actually, Mozart had a sister who was also a musical prodigy. Their father used to travel them around Austria, like, a little mini von Trapp family, and make them perform for nobility and for the public. And he was essentially like the dad equivalent of a stage mom, except he capitalized and made money on them. And so Mozart spent the very early parts of his life traveling and making music. By the time he was 5 years old, he was composing. His earliest compositions being things that we know, the variations on Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, stuff like that, which are exceptionally virtuosic. And that's what he did. He started at a very young age sitting at a harpsichord, which is much like a piano, and just playing. And Mozart was a bit of a parlor trick to most of the public. They weren't necessarily interested in the music, so to say, as much as they were that this young child is sitting here doing these things that they could not do. And then he got a reputation for himself. And his reputation really was that the works that he wrote were intriguing, they were creative, they were virtuosic when he played them. When somebody else played them, not nearly as entertaining. But when Mozart did, it was great. And so based on all of those things, nobility would contact Mozart and say, "I need you to write something for this special occasion." Mozart said, "Sure, for a price." Of course they did it, but common of the nobility at that time, there was a caveat. You will write the piece, I will pay you, I get to pass it off as my own composition. And so the nobility at the time, if you go back in time and read about them, they all have compositions that they wrote with very little musical experience. It's because they stole things. And that's just kind of how time worked then. And Mozart's final composition, the Requiem, is that. The Requiem itself was a commission. Mozart was actually in the middle of writing at the time, and I really have to think about this. I think it was the Magic Flute, the opera The Magic Flute. Mozart loved writing operas. He loved the comedic nature of opera. So he was in the middle of writing that. He was approached, this was the summer of 1791. He was approached by Franz von Walsek, who was a count in Austria. And Count Walsek said, "I would like to commission a requiem for the honoring the death of my wife." And it was a 1-year anniversary, essentially. So he wanted a Mass of the Dead to be performed, with the intent that he was going to pass it off as his own work. Mozart needed money. Mozart always needed money, because Mozart did very little work and composed very little work that was in demand. He mostly did things that he wanted to. Every once in a while, you get, he would take on a composition or a commission where somebody would say, I need a flute concerto. We have one actually that resulted from this. And Mozart said, "Yeah, I can do that." And what he would do is take something that he had already written, an oboe concerto in this instance, rewrote it for flute, passed it on, and said, "Here you go." And so he wasn't really interested in the financial aspects of it, but he was married. And as you know, there are responsibilities with that, and his wife was interested in the financial gains of employment, and to be certain. So he took the job. He said, yeah, I'll write the Requiem, fine. In November of the same year, he started to become ill. And he was writing the entire time, but as you know, when you feel sick, you can't always get up and do things. And so he would take these stints where he was writing for a little while, and then he would rest. And there were days where he couldn't do things. And it happened, again, we don't really know what the inherent issue was, what the inherent sickness was, although rheumatic fever is really what the suspicion was, because when he died, he was covered in a rash also. And so you'll find many reports that make statements like, it was kidney failure because he was a raging alcoholic. Was he a drinker? Yep, everybody was. That's just what happened. Did he die of alcoholism? Scholars believe no, he did not. Now, that's not great for film. And so it's much better in a movie to say he died of alcoholism and to portray him as a raging alcoholic. But, you know, Mozart had a temper, much as Beethoven did actually. And so there are things that led to this perception that he was a drunk. Not really the case. And so as he's getting sicker and sicker and sicker, it becomes apparent that he's not going to be able to finish the work. He gets sick in November, he dies in December. Yeah, 35 years old. The work is left unfinished. So the parts that we know Mozart had pretty much written of this Requiem is the opening. He wrote the opening, he wrote the next section, which is the Kyrie, and he had sketched out most of the orchestration for those, we believe. The next section of it, which in the Latin Mass, we call it the sequence, literally means that comes next. In that you have the Dies Irae, which is the Day of Wrath, and other sections leading up to the last thing that we know he wrote, which is the first 8 measures of the Lacrimosa. And those are the best 8 measures in the work. After that, he had some sketches of some things, but it wasn't his. And the work itself wasn't his. But how do you sell a commission by Mozart if Mozart doesn't write it? And that's what his wife Costanza had to deal with. So what she did was she approached his student, Franz Süssmayr, and she said, I need help. I have to have this finished, and we have to pass it off like he wrote it. And I will pay you to help, or to finish the work. However, I need the money, and so we can't tell people that Mozart didn't write this. And Süssmayr, who was a student of Mozart, said, okay, yep, I can do that. And so he did write it. They did move it along, they passed it along. However, I always think Costanza is like the world's greatest marketer when it comes to things like art and music. Because what she did was she started to create rumors about the work. So when it got out, you know, across large scale, that Mozart had passed away, all of a sudden these rumors start flying that Mozart realized it was his impending death. And so as he's writing the Requiem, he realizes he's probably writing it for himself. Again, it's super sensationalized. Not true. But we do believe that that part of it stemmed from her. Because what better way to promote a work and what better way to market a work than to steep it in something like that? You know, something where you think, here's one of the greatest giants of classical music writing his own death mass. What will that sound like? You know? And so, of course, everybody says, yeah, we want to hear this now. It isn't until later that Süssmayr actually says, he later claimed full authorship of multiple sections. The Sanctus, the Benedictus, the Agnus Dei, the Lux Aeterna, minus a few sketches that were in it. most of the Lacrimosa. And so before you know, you get down to like looking at the mass parts in general, and you realize Süssmayr wrote more of it than Mozart did. It's really Süssmayr's Mass inspired by Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. Yeah, and it's interesting. Here's why it's difficult, though. Singers hate that. Because Mozart is easy to sing. Süssmayr is difficult to sing. He doesn't write as effortlessly because, to be completely honest, he's not as talented. And Mozart, who writes these grand, elaborate double fugues and things, we'll get into that a little bit, but these grand, elaborate things, Süssmayr doesn't have the capacity to do that. So he does it in his way. He takes Mozart's hand sketches, which quite literally he sometimes wrote in the margins of papers, or little things and then crossed them out, and Süssmayr gets those and can kind of make something happen from that. And of course, he studied with Mozart, so he has some idea, but it's not easy. And so for singers, when you're rehearsing this, we actually went through this in rehearsal last night with the chorus, where we got to a part, and I said, so here's the thing, sopranos and altos, or sopranos and tenors, you have to be very cautious about the intonation here, because listen to what happens. And Catherine McMichael played it at the piano, and it's all of these, it's an interval of notes that are a fourth apart all the way through, and it moves parallel. Well, for those of you who don't know music, the only thing you need to know is when we write music, especially in the classical era, parallel fourths, fifths, and octaves, we don't write. Because they're unstable. It's not a mistake Mozart would have made in any of his compositions. But Süssmayr did it. So when the singers are singing these lines, and they're making these mistakes, and they're getting frustrated because I'm just yelling at them, keep it in tune, watch the pitch, it's got to be higher. They don't know necessarily why it's difficult. It's difficult because it's not organic. Because it's breaking rules that are there for a reason. Because it's not Mozart's writing. When you listen to the work, for those of you who will be at the concert, all of you, when you hear the work, you will be able to identify the parts that Mozart wrote and the parts that he didn't, even if you know nothing about it. You will hear things that you go, that doesn't quite sound right. Or, that's a little clunky. Or you think to yourself, that doesn't sound like the other parts. Well, that's true, and it is clunky. And there are entire movements. There's a hostias in it that should be beautiful. It's not. Inherently, it's not. It's not because it's sung poorly. It's because it's so difficult to make it beautiful the way that it's written. And the phrases of it, where you expect in your ear to hear a phrase end and the next one begin, and as listeners, we like expectation. We like to be able to identify something that's familiar. When you can't find that, it's not as enjoyable. It's why, Muzak and things like that were very difficult at the turn into the 20th century. But in terms of the Mozart Requiem, you will hear that. You'll hear parts that you think, it's pretty, but I don't know that it's great. And then you hear Mozart's compositions, and you think, wow, that's thrilling. Right from the onset. Of course, because it's a Requiem, it opens with a Requiem. Requiem aeterna. Rest eternal. And then it goes into parts of the Latin Mass, the Kyrie and the Christe eleison. The Kyrie and the Christe eleison are written in a double fugue. Now, again, many of you won't know that. So, let me just give you what is impressive about that. Bach invented the fugue. Fugues are difficult because fugues have more rules than anything else in the world. There isn't a political system that has more rules than fugues do when it comes to writing them. Yes. And so, the important part about fugues is that there's always a theme, and it comes back in multiple keys. There's always an answer, or a subject and a counter-subject that happen. And you hear them interspersed in the voices, but the voices, soprano, alto, tenor, bass, all move independently. So whereas they're singing at the same time, they're all independent lines moving at the same time. Mozart doubled it. So he wrote 2 themes occurring at the same time. In a typical Kyrie, you get the iteration first of Kyrie eleison, Lord have mercy. And then following that, you get Christe eleison, Christ have mercy. Mozart superimposed the 2 together. So you get Lord have mercy and Christ have mercy happening at the exact same time. And it is impressive. And it's fast. And there's a lot of runs moving through it. It's challenging for the singers, but not impossible. And so you'll hear it and you'll go, wow, that is something. This happens a lot throughout both of these works, actually. Moments where you're going to hear something you'll say, that's impressive. So, here's the rough of all of it, I think. Mozart and Beethoven were great composers because they deserved that. What they did, the prolific writing, the skill with which they wrote, they deserved the accolades they got. But they also wrote for themselves. They wrote because they wanted to, not because they had to mass produce things. Did they mass produce things? Yes. But that's what inspiration is. That's what musical inspiration is. Artistic inspiration in general does those things for you. They're both young composers in the classical era. And so communication, not as fast as it is now. You know, by the time Mozart died, it would have taken months for people in Europe to know Mozart had died. Same with Beethoven. By the time a work had been premiered in Vienna, it would have taken a long time for the outside areas, particularly Italy, because it's difficult to get things to Italy at this point, to know that these works existed. And yet, even despite those challenges, their youth, the fact that they weren't producing for consumerism, we still have all of it today. We're still talking about these pieces right now. I, at 39 years old, have already spent over half of my life focusing on composers like this. And so that really tells you the importance of not only of what they did, but of who they were. And for performing concerts and things like that. Often when I program, I think to myself, what does an audience want to hear? What do I want to perform? Sometimes those 2 things are in agreement, sometimes they're not. The one thing that I can almost always guarantee or bank on is if I can program something by Mozart, by Beethoven, by Leonard Bernstein, people will show up. I want to do it, people want to hear it. Lasting legacies are important, but lasting legacies are only important when the legacy has been earned. And in this case, you have an opportunity, Saginaw has an opportunity to hear 2 remarkable works performed live music, doesn't happen like it used to, but performed live with an orchestra, with a chorus made up of community members, and a chorus that will also include high school students. So, as the assistant principal over at Saginaw Arts and Sciences Academy, for many of you, you know, and if you don't know, you do now, SASA has been under renovation because we moved into Arthur Hill. So Arthur Hill has to be renovated and updated to support the type of programming that we do. Because of that, we don't currently have an auditorium that's functioning. And so our voice keyboard concentration with the choirs in it, at the beginning of the year, wasn't sure what they would do for a spring performance. The teacher for that course is the director for the Saginaw Youth Choir under the Saginaw Choral Society, Emerald Joyner Christensen. So we were talking, and I said, well, why don't they just come sing with us? They could sing the Requiem and the Beethoven. And everyone went, really? I said, yeah, why not? I mean, truthfully, like, if anything, it's just a remarkable experience for them, and an opportunity to do something that high school students don't get to do. No high school anywhere nearby is performing the Mozart Requiem with an orchestra, and they're certainly not doing it on the same program that they've got a Beethoven, the Choral Fantasy. And so we've got kids, ages 14 through 17, who get this opportunity. They are doing it remarkably well. Here's my favorite part. I periodically go into class and I'll talk to them about things, or I listen to what's going on, or we just have sidebar conversations in the hallway. And they're genuinely excited. They love the work. They love the Mozart. Beethoven they tolerate. They're not thrilled with German. Fair. But to them, it's just what they do. It's not anything outside of that. Saginaw has remarkable opportunities for people. And this is one of those things. The fact that we have an organization, a nonprofit music organization, that can collaborate with an Arts and Sciences Academy to produce works like this is fantastic. These are the things that you don't read about in the news, unfortunately. Well, fair enough. I'll take that. But it's happening. And it will continue to happen. And it happens because not only are the structures there to support that, the community is there to support that. If you have no other reason, if you're not even interested in hearing Beethoven and Mozart, at least come watch high schoolers do it. Because you want to talk about impressive, that's impressive. These are works that challenge adults with degrees. And we've got kids doing it, and in some ways are coming to rehearsals more prepared than adults. Yes. That has changed over the past couple of weeks when some of my adults realize, oh, they notice. But also, I get to look at people, I get to look out and watch a community chorus making music of the age ranges between 13 or 14 up to many more decades beyond that. Show me another part in life where that happens. Give me one other instance where that happens and everybody, regardless of their age or standing, is equally as important. I'll wait. It doesn't happen. This is the importance of art in a community. This is the importance of live music in a community. This is the importance of supporting education. Because it's not always about what they're being taught. It's about how the process happens and what they learn from that. There are some singers who come in to SASA and say, they pop in and out of rehearsals actually. They're not always in adult rehearsals with me. But they've been in and out, and then they go back to their classmates who didn't show up for that specific rehearsal and say, we've got to work on this. Because they realize that everybody else knows it, and they need to know it when they come back. And likewise, I've had adults who come up and they're like, that kid knows this stuff. I'm like, are you intimidated? So you have younger and older generations genuinely helping one another without any motive behind it. That's why we do this. That's why we support this. That's why I'm talking to you right now. Are Mozart and Beethoven great? Absolutely. They were interesting. But here's the deal. This is happening in your backyard. Actually, it's happening in your front yard. You can't avoid it. It's here. Support that. Support live music in your community. Support the people that you see singing on stage, that you shop with, that you work with, that you are neighbors with. And support the fact that we have schools in this community that also support these things. And if we don't support them, they cease to exist. And then everything we see is news about ulterior motives. I'm going to give you an hour and a half in a concert with no ulterior motives. Not one. I won't even ask you to donate $1 to the organization. You're welcome to. But no ulterior motives. Just come see it happen. All right. I believe I have roughly 10 minutes or so.
Yes.
Any questions for me? Anybody have anything they want to ask or say? Be polite. Go ahead.
We have the privilege of having scheduled at the end of next month in Ballspring Senior Living Independent, Catherine McMichael to play for us.
Excellent.
She's coming back from Peru.
Of course she is. Catherine is fascinating. For those of you who do not know, and I'm sure most of you do, aside from being a world-renowned composer and a remarkable pianist, she's an avid traveler. She, this past summer/fall, I believe, went to Antarctica, and then took handbells because it was the only continent, she believed, that had never had handbells performed on it. Yeah, right out of Saginaw. Yeah, she's a remarkable force. That's going to be excellent. Other things? Questions, comments? Yes?
After Beethoven went deaf, was he able to be the conductor at a performance?
I don't believe he ever did after he went deaf. He was very frustrated, of course, for a number of years. But I think Beethoven probably realized at that point, and we don't know this for sure, but I do believe he realized he was not his compositions don't sound as effortless after he goes deaf as they did when he could hear. Is it still impressive? Absolutely it is. They're not as pleasant always. To that end, let me also tell you, look on the horizon. This isn't the last Beethoven SCS we'll be doing. We're working on things for the next season. And something you should know about the choral fantasy. For those of you who know Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, this is the one that ends in the chorus screaming their heads off in the Ode to Joy theme of that da 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 da. When you hear the choral fantasy, you will hear parts of that you go, gosh, that sounds vaguely familiar. The chorus parts are vaguely familiar of that theme from the Ninth Symphony. Now, the choral fantasy was written before. Mozart wrote to a friend when he was writing the Ninth Symphony, and he said, this feels like I'm writing a more mature version of my choral fantasia. And so you get this idea of this Ninth Symphony theme, which everybody knows. Even if you don't know Beethoven, everybody has heard it at some point. You get a glimpse of it in this, in its earliest iterations, earliest concepts. Beethoven and Mozart actually were also fans of stealing from their own works. So that was a thing. Borrowing themes over and over. Tammy.